Close your eyes and imagine the sound of cards shuffling across green felt, the gentle clink of glasses, the murmur of conversation in a London club as candles flicker against dark wood panelling. It's a winter evening in 1762, and somewhere in that room, someone is about to ask for something so simple, so perfectly practical, that it will echo through centuries. Not a grand invention born of laboratories or workshops, but a quiet moment of hunger meeting convenience. 2 slices of bread. Something savoury between them, hands that needn't leave the game, clothes that needn't be stained, a meal that asks for nothing but itself. How did this happen? Where did this idea truly begin? And how did a simple stack of ingredients travel from ancient hearths to gaming tables to lunchboxes carried by children on their way to school? Let's follow the bread and see where it leads us. But before that, comment below which country you are watching from. Before there was a sandwich, there was bread, doing something remarkable. It was the plate itself. Picture a great hall in medieval Europe, sometime in the 1300s. Stone walls rise toward timber ceilings blackened by centuries of hearth smoke. Long tables stretch across the room, and at those tables nobles and merchants gather for their evening meal. But look closely at what sits before them. No ceramic dishes, no wooden trenchers yet, just thick slabs of bread cut from loaves baked 3 or 4 days earlier, their crusts gone hard and sturdy. These are called trenchers, from the old French word trancher, meaning to cut, and they're about to become the foundation of the meal. A servant approaches with a steaming pot of beef stew, rich with wine and herbs. He ladles it carefully onto the bread plate, and the trencher does its work, soaking up the gravy, cradling the chunks of meat, holding everything together while the diner tears at it with fingers and knife. By the end of the meal, the bread has transformed. It's heavy with juice and flavour, soft where once it was hard, and now comes the moment of choice. If you're wealthy, you might pass your sauce-soaked trencher to a servant who will gather them all and take them to the poor waiting at the gate. If you're of more modest means, this bread plate is now the best part of your meal, and you'll eat every morsel. The trencher wasn't unique to England. Across medieval Europe, bread served this double purpose, sustenance and serving vessel both. In the Polish city of Wrocław, bakers followed strict regulations about trencher bread, using specific ratios of rye and wheat, ensuring the bread would be dense enough to hold a meal without falling apart. The bread had to be just right, not too fresh, which would make it too soft, but not so stale it would crack and spill its precious cargo onto the wooden table below. Think about the genius of this for a moment. In a time before mass production of ceramics, before standardized anything really, bread became the universal plate. It required no firing in kilns, no expensive materials, no specialized craftsmen. Every baker could make it, every household could use it. And when the meal was done, there was no washing up, just the choice of eating your plate or giving it away. But trenchers were more than practical. They were woven into the social fabric of medieval life. The quality of bread you ate from announced your status as surely as the clothes you wore. White bread trenchers were a luxury, made from finely bolted wheat flour, the bran sifted away until only pale, soft flour remained. These graced the tables of lords and bishops. Common folk made do with darker breads, rye mixed with barley, sometimes with peas or beans ground into the flour when times were lean. The bread you used as your plate told everyone exactly where you stood in the world's estimation. There's something tender about this practice when you think about it long enough. Here was a society finding ways to waste nothing, to honour the work of growing grain and baking bread by using it completely. The trencher that held a lord's venison at supper might, by night's end, fill the belly of a beggar at the gate. Bread moved through the household like a kind of currency of compassion, starting as utility and ending as charity. By the 1500s, wooden trenchers began to replace bread ones in wealthier households. These were simple affairs, flat rounds or squares of oak or beech, sometimes with a small depression carved for salt at the rim. They lasted longer, of course, and could be turned over to use the other side for a second course. But they never quite captured the magic of the bread trencher, that lovely completeness of a meal that ate itself. The transition was gradual. Bread trenchers remained common in modest homes and at large gatherings where feeding many people meant finding the most economical solutions. Even as pewter and pottery became more common, even as forks began to appear on European tables, the memory of eating from bread lingered. Because here's the thing about bread. It's never just bread. It's the staff of life the body shared, the foundation of the meal. Making it into a plate only emphasized what everyone already knew. Bread was essential. Bread was everywhere. Bread held everything together. And in some corner of human memory, perhaps, the idea settled in. Bread could be more than bread. It could be vessel and meal at once. It could hold things, carry things, make things possible. That understanding would travel forward through time, waiting for the right moment to emerge in a new form. But we must travel further back and eastward, because the story of putting food inside bread is far older than medieval Europe. In the hills of Armenia, in the fertile crescent of ancient Mesopotamia, across the plateaus of Persia and Anatolia, people have been baking flatbreads for thousands of years. These weren't the risen loaves of European tradition, thick and rounded and golden. These were thin sheets of dough slapped against the scorching walls of clay ovens called tandoors, emerging blistered and charred in spots, flexible and warm, smelling of wheat and smoke and ancient craft. The bread had many names: lavash in Armenia, yufka in Turkey, sangak in Persia, but the principle was the same. You took flour and water, sometimes a bit of salt, and you rolled it paper thin. The resulting bread was a marvel of practicality. Fresh from the oven, it was soft and pliable, perfect for wrapping around meat or vegetables or cheese. Left to dry, it could be stacked like paper and stored for months, even a year, waiting to be sprinkled with water and brought back to life. Picture a shepherd in the Armenian highlands centuries ago, breaking his fast. He reaches for a piece of dried lavash, moistens it slightly, and wraps it around a handful of fresh herbs and a crumble of white cheese. This is breakfast, lunch, dinner, the bread serving as both wrapper and part of the meal itself. He doesn't need utensils. He doesn't need a fire. The bread and what it holds are everything he needs, portable and complete. In the cities of the Ottoman Empire, this tradition flourished into an art form. Street vendors sold doner kebab, thin slices of spit-roasted meat wrapped in fresh lavash or tucked into pita. The bread caught the juices, absorbed the flavors, transformed from simple carbohydrate into something richer. This was food you could eat while walking, while talking, while conducting business in the marketplace. The bread made it all possible. There's a beautiful practicality to flatbreads that risen loaves can never quite match. They bake in minutes rather than hours. They require no waiting for yeast to work its slow magic. A woman could slap dough against the wall of a tandoor in the morning and have fresh bread by the time her family stirred. And because the bread was thin, it cooled quickly, making it easier to handle, easier to fold, easier to carry. But practicality wasn't the only reason these traditions endured. There was ritual woven into the bread as well. In Armenia, when a bride entered her new home, her mother-in-law would drape lavash over her shoulders, a blessing of abundance, a wish for warmth and sustenance in the marriage ahead. The making of lavash was often communal, a gathering of women who would spend a day preparing enough bread to last weeks or months. They'd form an assembly line of sorts, one rolling the dough, another stretching it wider, a third slapping it onto the curved inner wall of the tandoor, a fourth carefully peeling it away when it was done. The room would fill with warmth and steam and conversation, the rhythm of work becoming its own kind of comfort. This wasn't just baking, it was maintenance of connection, the bread binding the community together even as it would later bind meat and herbs in a simple meal. Travel west to the Netherlands in the 1600s and you'd find another variation on the theme. The naturalist John Ray, visiting Dutch taverns, noted with interest how beef hung from the rafters, which they cut into thin slices and eat with bread and butter, laying the slices upon the butter. This wasn't quite a sandwich as we'd know it. The bread was open-faced, the meat arranged on top rather than enclosed. But the principle was there. Bread as foundation, meat as what made it a meal, everything designed to be picked up and eaten without ceremony. These weren't innovations, they were ancient solutions to a timeless problem. How do you make food portable? How do you eat without elaborate preparation or cleanup? How do you honor hunger with something that satisfies both belly and hand? Bread provided the answer, again and again, across cultures and centuries. Sometimes it was plate, sometimes wrapper, sometimes foundation, but always it was essential. And here's what's remarkable. None of these traditions needed a name. No one called it a wrap or a sandwich or anything else requiring special designation. It was just food, just the way things were done, just what made sense when you had bread and something to put with it. The practice was so natural, so obvious, that it barely required comment. Until one evening in London, when it suddenly did. Let's step into London in the autumn of 1762. When the city was a tumult of coffee houses and clubs, of merchants and lords, of old money meeting new ideas in rooms thick with tobacco smoke and political intrigue. John Montague, the 4th Earl of Sandwich, was not a young man anymore. He was 44 that year, and the decades had been full. He'd travelled widely in his youth, not just the typical grand tour of France and Italy that young aristocrats were expected to make, but all the way to Greece and Turkey and Egypt, places that most Englishmen of his class only read about in books. He'd seen the Ottoman Empire firsthand, watched how people ate in Constantinople, observed the street vendors selling food wrapped in flatbread, noted the practical genius of meals that required no ceremony. Now he was back in England, deeply embroiled in politics and naval administration. As First Lord of the Admiralty, he carried the weight of the British fleet on his shoulders. The 7 Years' War had recently ended, and there were ships to maintain, officers to appoint, budgets to manage, and endless meetings to attend. The work consumed him. He was known for staying at his desk long into the night, foregoing proper meals, impatient with anything that took him away from the papers that demanded his attention. But he also loved to gamble, not in a reckless way, though his enemies would later say otherwise, but with the particular intensity that some men bring to games of chance and strategy. Cards were an obsession for many in his circle, and the gaming clubs of London provided refuge from the weight of public service. Here, at tables covered in green felt, with wine and punch flowing freely, a man could set aside the burden of empire and focus on something deliciously trivial. On one such evening, we don't know the exact date, though it must have been before November, Montague found himself deep in a game. Perhaps it was cribbage, perhaps whist, perhaps something else entirely. The hour grew late. Dinner had been served at 4 in the afternoon, as was customary, and Montague had missed it, too engrossed in work or play to join the formal meal. Now it was evening. His stomach was making its needs known, but the cards were good and the game compelling. He didn't want to stop, didn't want to leave the table, wash his hands, sit down to a proper meal with all its ritual and time and distraction. He wanted to keep playing, but he also needed to eat, so he did what anyone might do when caught between appetite and attention. He improvised. He called to a servant and made a request that seemed, in the moment, entirely unremarkable. "Bring me some meat between 2 pieces of bread, something I can eat with one hand while I play." Nothing elaborate, just bread and cold beef, perhaps toasted, perhaps not. Practical, simple, sufficient. The servant obliged. What came back was exactly what had been requested: sliced cold roast beef tucked between 2 pieces of toasted bread. Montague picked it up, ate it while continuing his game, and thought little more of it. His cards stayed clean. His hands remained relatively ungreased. The meal required no interruption. It was perfect. But here's where the story shifts from personal habit to cultural moment. Montague wasn't eating alone. The other men at the table watched this unusual sight. A lord of the realm eating what looked like provisions, peasant food, something you might pack for travel but certainly not serve yourself in polite company. And yet, it made sense. They could see the elegance of it, the sheer practicality. Why should eating require ceremony when the goal was simply to satisfy hunger? Someone else asked for the same as sandwich, then another and another. Within weeks, maybe days, ordering food this way had a name in the clubs Montague frequented. Not meat between bread or the gaming table meal, but simply a sandwich, named for the man who'd made it fashionable, even though he'd hardly invented the idea at all. The story might have ended there, a footnote in the social history of London clubs. But it didn't, because someone wrote it down. Edward Gibbon, historian and gentleman, kept a diary. On November 24th, 1762, he recorded an evening at the Cocoa Tree, one of London's fashionable gaming clubs. His entry captures a moment that might otherwise have vanished entirely. "I dined at the Cocoa Tree," he wrote. "That respectable body, of which I have the honour of being a member, affords every evening a sight truly English. 20 or 30 perhaps of the first men in the kingdom, in point of fashion and fortune, supping at little tables covered with a napkin, in the middle of a coffee room, upon a bit of cold meat, or a sandwich, and drinking a glass of punch." There it is, the first written reference to a sandwich by name. Not described or explained, just mentioned casually as if everyone already knew what it meant, which suggests that by late November of 1762, the word had already entered the vocabulary of London's club set, already become common enough to need no introduction. But Gibbon wasn't the last to write about it. A few years later, a French writer named Pierre-Jean Grosley visited London. and recorded his observations in a book called A Tour to London. Grosley had a sharp eye for English peculiarities, and he didn't entirely approve of what he saw. His account includes a pointed description. A minister of state passed 24 hours at a public gaming table, so absorbed in play that during the whole time he had no subsistence but a bit of beef, between 2 slices of toasted bread which he eat without ever quitting the game. Grosley never names Montagu directly, but everyone understood who he meant. The story took on a life of its own. The gambling-obsessed lord too fixated on cards to eat properly, sustaining himself on this makeshift meal for an entire day and night. It made a good tale, scandalous and slightly absurd, exactly the kind of story that people love to repeat. Was it true? Probably not, at least not in such extreme form. Grosley had a tendency to embellish, and 24 hours without leaving a gaming table seems unlikely even for the most dedicated gambler. But truth matters less than perception when it comes to how words enter language. The sandwich had a name now and a story attached to it, and that was enough. But who was John Montagu really, beyond the gambling stories and the food that bears his name? He was born on November 13, 1718, into a family of considerable lineage but uncertain fortune. His father died when John was only 4 years old, leaving the boy heir to a title but not much else. His mother remarried quickly and had little further contact with her sons. At age 7, young John was sent to Eton, that great forge of English gentlemen, where he learned Latin and Greek and how to navigate the complex social hierarchies of elite education. By age 10, he'd inherited his grandfather's title, becoming the 4th Earl of Sandwich. Though the earldom came with more prestige than money, his grandmother had fled to Paris with what remained of the family fortune, supporting the exiled Stuart dynasty and threatening to disinherit John if he showed loyalty to King George. His younger brother William was sent to sea at age 11. It was not by any measure an easy childhood, yet Montagu proved himself remarkable. At Eton he rose to head of the 5th form, distinguishing himself in a system not known for encouraging academic excellence. He continued to Trinity College, Cambridge, where he developed the intellectual curiosity that would mark his entire life. And then, as was expected of young men of his class, he set out on the grand tour, but with a twist. Most aristocrats visited France and Italy, saw the standard sights, collected the expected experiences, and returned home to settle into English life. Montagu went further, much further. He travelled through Italy, yes, but then continued to Greece. Not the classical sights alone, but the living, breathing Greece under Ottoman rule. He sailed to Turkey, visited Constantinople, journeyed through Egypt, saw Malta and Gibraltar in Spain. This was 1838 to 1739, when such travel was genuinely adventurous, even dangerous. What did he see in those Ottoman lands? Street life, certainly. The vendors selling food from carts, the practice of wrapping meat in flatbread, the portable meals that fed a city on the move. Did those observations plant a seed that would flower decades later in a London gaming club? We can't know for certain, but it seems likely that a man curious enough to travel so far would have been curious enough to notice how people ate. He returned to England and entered public life. At age 20, he took his seat in the House of Lords. The positions followed in succession: Lord of the Admiralty, Secretary of State, Postmaster General. He married Dorothy Fane, and by all accounts they were happy together, living modestly despite his growing prominence. They had children. He worked constantly, earning a reputation as someone who stayed at his desk long past when others had gone home. But then tragedy struck. His wife's mind began to fail, slipping gradually into what was then called madness, and what we might now recognize as dementia or mental illness. There was no treatment, no understanding, just the slow disappearance of the woman he'd married. Eventually she had to be confined, placed somewhere she could be cared for while Montagu continued his public duties. It was during this period that he began a long relationship with Martha Ray, a singer. Their connection was genuine, it seems. She bore him at least 5 children, possibly as many as 9, and they remained together for years. But Montagu, for all his power and position, couldn't marry her or fully provide for her and their children in the way society demanded. The situation was awkward, complicated, threaded through with the kind of personal pain that official biographies tend to gloss over. In 1779, tragedy struck again. Martha Ray was murdered outside a theatre by a man named James Hackman, who'd been obsessed with her and couldn't bear her rejection. The murder was sensational, shocking London society, and Montagu was devastated. He withdrew from public life shortly after, retiring to his family estate at Hinchingbrook House. This is the man who gave his name to a sandwich. Not a cartoon figure of a gambling aristocrat, but someone far more complicated. He was intellectually curious, travelling far beyond what convention demanded. He was hard-working, known for his long hours and dedication to naval administration. He supported exploration, funding Captain James Cook's voyages to the Pacific, leading Cook to name the Hawaiian Islands the Sandwich Islands in his honor. He faced personal tragedies that would have broken lesser men, and kept going. His enemies, and he had many, politics being what it was, portrayed him as incompetent and corrupt. The saying went, "Seldom has any man held so many offices and accomplished so little." They mocked his lifestyle, his mistress, his tendency to work through meals. They repeated Grosley's gambling story with relish, painting him as frivolous and dissipated. But modern historians have been kinder, recognizing that much of Montagu's poor reputation came from political rivals who had reason to slander him. The man who emerges from a more careful reading was capable, dedicated, and genuinely interested in the world beyond England's shores. He lived 80 years, dying in 1792, long after he'd left public service. And in all that time, in all those decades of political manoeuvring and personal tragedy and genuine accomplishment, what people remembered most was that he'd ordered meat between bread at a gaming table one evening in 1762. History has a sense of humour, doesn't it? Of all the things Montagu did, the ships he maintained, the explorers he funded, the administrative reforms he implemented, the thing that carries his name forward through centuries is something he probably thought about for all of 30 seconds, a simple request for practical food, a moment of hunger meeting convenience. But perhaps that's exactly right. Perhaps the small human moments are the ones that matter most, the ones that actually change how people live. Montagu's work in the Admiralty is footnoted in history books. His sandwich is eaten billions of times a day everywhere on Earth by people who've never heard of the Earl of Sandwich but who reach for 2 slices of bread and something to put between them without a second thought. There's something miraculous about how language works, how a word can appear in one place and then, like dandelion seeds on the wind, scatter everywhere. The sandwich had a name by late 1762, at least in the gaming clubs and coffee houses of London, where men like Edward Gibbon and John Montagu spent their evenings. But London was just one city, and England just one country, and for a word to truly take hold, it needs to travel beyond its birthplace, needs to prove itself useful to people who've never met the Earl of Sandwich and don't care about his gambling habits. At first, the sandwich remained a curiosity of the upper classes. In those early years, it appeared primarily in gentlemen's clubs, the Cocoa Tree, the Union Club, the Beefsteak Club at the Shakespeare Tavern. These were exclusive spaces where aristocrats and wealthy merchants gathered to gamble, drink, and talk politics away from the constraints of formal dining. The sandwich fit perfectly into this world. It was quick, it was casual, it required no servants hovering with clean plates and fresh courses. A man could eat and continue whatever he was doing without interruption. But something interesting happened as the 1700s gave way to the 1800s. The sandwich began appearing at different kinds of gatherings, evening parties where guests stood and mingled rather than sitting for formal meals, outdoor excursions and picnics where elaborate dining was impossible, theatre intervals where hunger struck but time was limited, train journeys once railways began crisscrossing Britain, where passengers needed food that could be eaten in a bouncing carriage without creating a mess. The sandwich proved itself endlessly adaptable. You could make it with any kind of bread, white or brown, toasted or fresh. You could fill it with cold roast beef like Montagu had, or ham, or cheese, or egg salad, or cucumber and butter for afternoon tea. It could be hearty enough for a labourer's lunch, or delicate enough for a lady's afternoon social. The basic formula, bread, filling, bread, was so simple that anyone could make it, so flexible that it could fit any occasion. By the 1820s and 30s, sandwich recipes began appearing in cookbooks. They were still somewhat unusual, still worth explaining, but no longer shocking or peculiar. Hannah Glass's The Art of Cookery and similar volumes included instructions for various sandwich preparations, treating them as legitimate food rather than makeshift gambling snacks. The sandwich was becoming respectable. And as the British Empire spread across the globe to India, Australia, Africa, the Caribbean, the sandwich travelled with it. British colonists and administrators carried their food habits wherever they went, and the sandwich, being so practical and portable, went everywhere. It adapted to local ingredients, local tastes, local needs. In India, it might be filled with curried chicken. In Australia, with cold lamb. In the West Indies, with tropical fruits and local cheeses. But the real explosion came with America. The United States in the 1800s was a nation of movement, people pushing westward, building railways and canals, working long hours in factories and fields, needing food that could travel, that didn't require elaborate preparation or cleanup. The sandwich was perfect for this new, restless country. Italian immigrants brought their own interpretation: submarine sandwiches, hoagies, grinders, names varying by region but the principle the same. A long roll split and filled generously with meats and cheeses and vegetables. Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe brought their delicatessen traditions, creating towering sandwiches of pastrami and corned beef on rye bread, as much monument as meal. The sandwich became a canvas for cultural expression, each group of newcomers adding their own touches, their own flavors, their own understanding of what made food satisfying. By the late 1800s, sandwiches were appearing in American fiction and journalism. They were no longer novelties requiring explanation, but ordinary facts of daily life. Workers carried them to factories, children brought them to school, travellers bought them at railway stations. The sandwich had become invisible through ubiquity, so common that people stopped thinking about its origins, stopped wondering who'd first thought to put meat between bread, stopped caring that it had once been named for an English earl most Americans had never heard of. And yet the name persisted. That's the truly remarkable thing. Other foods lost their eponymous origins. No one thinks about the Earl of whoever when eating a Wellington or a Melba toast, but sandwich stuck, carrying John Montagu's title forward through the centuries without most people ever knowing why the word existed at all. Language scholars call this semantic bleaching. When a word becomes so common that its original meaning fades away, leaving just the sound and the general sense, the sandwich experienced something like the opposite. It became common, yes, ubiquitous even, but the word itself remained specific, irreplaceable. You couldn't call it something else without losing something essential. The sandwich was a sandwich, and that was that. In other languages, the word was borrowed directly or translated. In French, un sandwich. In German, ein Sandwich. In Spanish, unsandwich. Some languages created their own terms, the Dutch broodje, the Swedish smörgås, but even these often existed alongside sandwich as a more international, cosmopolitan option. The Earl's name, transformed into a common noun, became a kind of linguistic currency, universally recognized and accepted. By 1900, barely 140 years after Edward Gibbon had written the word in his diary, the sandwich was everywhere. It had jumped class boundaries, crossed oceans, adapted to countless cuisines. It was high society and working class, British and American, and increasingly global. It was picnic food and party food and everyday sustenance. It had become, in a very real sense, one of the basic forms that food could take, as fundamental as soup or salad or roast. And through all this spreading and adapting and evolving, the core idea remained unchanged. Bread, filling, bread. Simple enough for anyone to make, versatile enough to satisfy any taste, practical enough to fit into any life. The sandwich had found its place in the world, not through grand proclamation or imperial decree, but through the quiet democracy of usefulness. People kept eating them because they worked, but there was a problem with sandwiches, one so fundamental that people barely noticed it, because it had always existed. Someone had to slice the bread. Picture yourself in a kitchen in 1925. You're making lunch for your family, simple sandwiches, nothing fancy. You pull out the loaf of bread baked yesterday or perhaps bought from the local bakery. It sits on your cutting board, golden and round, still holding its shape. You pick up your bread knife and begin to slice. The first piece comes off uneven, thicker on one side, thinner on the other. The second is better, but still not quite right. By the time you've cut enough slices for everyone's sandwiches, you have an array of pieces that vary in thickness, some crusty edge pieces that no one wants, some centerpieces that are perfect, some that are slightly squashed from the pressure of the knife. It takes time and attention, and even when you're skilled at it, the results are inconsistent. Now multiply that small annoyance by millions of households making sandwiches for lunch every single day. Think about all that time spent slicing, all those uneven pieces, all that minor frustration accepted as simply the way things were. In Davenport, Iowa, a jeweler named Otto Frederick Rohwedder was thinking about this problem. He'd been thinking about it for years, actually, since around 1912 when the idea first struck him. What if bread could be sliced by a machine uniformly and perfectly before it ever reached the customer? People thought he was mad. Rohwedder had no background in baking or engineering. He was an optician by training, a jeweler by trade, someone who understood precision and careful measurement but knew nothing about bread production. And yet he was convinced this could work. Convinced enough that in 1916 he sold his 3 jewelry stores and devoted himself entirely to building a bread slicing machine. The challenges were considerable. Bread isn't like wood or metal, it's soft, compressible, irregular in texture. Slice it too roughly and you'll squash it. Slice it when it's too fresh and it'll fall apart. The slices need to stay together somehow, or you'll just have a pile of separate pieces. And even if you could slice bread mechanically, wouldn't it go stale faster, exposed to air on both sides? Rohwedder experimented for years, building prototypes, testing mechanisms, trying to solve problems that revealed themselves only through trial and error. And then in 1917, disaster struck. A fire destroyed his workshop, consuming his prototype machine and all his blueprints. Everything he'd worked for, gone. A lesser man might have given up. Rohwedder was also diagnosed with a condition that doctors said would kill him within a few years. Another reason to abandon this quixotic quest, but he didn't. He started over, rebuilding from memory, refining his design, pushing forward despite skepticism from everyone around him. Bakers were particularly doubtful. They'd been slicing bread by hand for centuries. Why would customers want machine-sliced bread? Wouldn't it seem impersonal, mass-produced, inferior? And what about that staleness problem? No, they told Rohwedder. This will never work. People won't buy it. But Rohwedder had an answer to the staleness concern. His machine would both slice and wrap the bread, holding the slices together and protecting them from air. By 1927, he'd created a device that could do exactly that. Multi-bladed, power-driven, capable of slicing a loaf into uniform pieces and then encasing it in wax paper, all in one continuous process. Now he needed someone willing to try it. Most bakers refused, unwilling to risk their reputations on what seemed like a gimmick. But in Chillicothe, Missouri, a baker named Frank Bench was struggling. His small bakery wasn't doing well, and he needed something to distinguish himself from competitors. When Rohwedder approached him with this strange invention, Bench decided he had little to lose. On July 7, 1928, the Chillicothe Baking Company began selling clean-made sliced bread to the public. It was the first commercially sliced bread in the world, each loaf machine cut into uniform pieces just under half an inch thick, wrapped in paper printed with Bench's bakery name. The local newspaper, the Chillicothe Constitution Tribune, announced this innovation with an article that tried to prepare readers for something that might seem strange. The idea of sliced bread may be startling to some people, it acknowledged. Certainly it represents a definite departure from the usual manner of supplying the consumer with baked loaves. But then the article went on to describe the advantages, and you can feel the writer's growing enthusiasm. The slices were perfect, the exact counterpart of its fellows, each one identical in thickness. They were so neat and precise that they were definitely better than anyone could possibly slice by hand with a bread knife. This was, the article concluded, a refinement that will receive a hearty and permanent welcome. The newspaper was right. Customers loved sliced bread immediately and completely. Within 2 weeks, Bench's bread sales had increased by 2,000%. 2,000%. People who'd been buying from other bakeries switched to Bench. People who'd been baking at home started buying store bread instead. The convenience was simply irresistible. Open the package, pull out as many slices as you need, make your sandwich, and you're done. No cutting board, no knife, no uneven slices. Word spread quickly. Other bakers contacted Rohwedder, wanting machines of their own. He could barely keep up with demand, frantically manufacturing units in his small Davenport workshop. By 1929, sliced bread was available in bakeries across Iowa and Missouri. By 1930, Continental Baking Company introduced Wonder Bread as pre-sliced loaves distributed nationally. Within 3 years, American bakeries were selling more sliced bread than unsliced. The transformation happened with stunning speed. A technology that hadn't existed in 1927 was by 1933 the dominant way Americans bought bread. The old way, buying a whole loaf and slicing it yourself, began to seem quaint, old-fashioned, unnecessarily difficult, and this revolution had immediate effects on sandwich culture. Making sandwiches became faster, easier, more consistent. Children could make their own lunches without adult supervision. Workers could throw together a sandwich in seconds before heading to the factory. The sandwich, already popular, became even more central to American eating habits because the barrier to entry had essentially disappeared. There was another unexpected benefit. The pop-up toaster, invented in 1926 by Charles Strite, suddenly became far more practical. Previously, toasting bread meant slicing it yourself and hoping the pieces fit in the toaster slots. Now every slice was uniform, guaranteed to fit perfectly. Sales of automatic toasters boomed alongside sliced bread sales, each innovation reinforcing the other. By the 1940s, sliced bread had become so essential to American life that its temporary disappearance created a crisis. During World War II, the government briefly banned sliced bread as a conservation measure, trying to save the steel that went into making slicing machines. The public outcry was immediate and intense. People were furious. Letter-writing campaigns flooded government offices. Within months, the ban was reversed. Sliced bread was too important to sacrifice, even for the war effort. The saying entered the language around this time, the greatest thing since sliced bread. It became the ultimate compliment, the benchmark of innovation, the standard against which all improvements were measured. And it was apt. Sliced bread really had changed daily life in fundamental ways, making a routine task so much easier that people couldn't imagine going back. Rowetter, the jeweler who'd had this strange obsession, lived to see his invention transform the world. Despite his dire medical diagnosis, he survived until 1960, dying at age 80, having outlived the doctor's predictions by decades. His bread slicing machine is now in the Smithsonian, a testament to how small innovations can have enormous impacts. Frank Bench, the baker who'd taken a chance on this odd contraption, wasn't so fortunate. He lost his bakery during the Great Depression, unable to capitalize on the revolution he'd helped start. But his willingness to try something new, his openness to possibility, had changed the way millions of people ate. And the sandwich? The sandwich became easier than ever, more democratic, more universally accessible. The Earl of Sandwich's convenient meal for gamblers had evolved into everyday sustenance for everyone, aided by an Iowa jeweler's persistent vision of bread that cut itself. In the decades following sliced bread's arrival, something remarkable happened. America transformed the sandwich from British convenience food into something distinctly its own. The 1900s were years of vast immigration, waves of people arriving from Italy, Germany, Poland, Russia, Ireland, China, Mexico, each group bringing their own food traditions, their own understanding of what made a meal satisfying. And the sandwich, that simple format of bread-filling bread, proved infinitely adaptable to new ingredients, new flavors, new identities. In New York City, Jewish delicatessens became temples of the sandwich arts. These weren't dainty afternoon tea affairs or quick gaming table snacks. These were architectural achievements. Sandwiches piled so high with pastrami or corned beef that you could barely fit them in your mouth. Meat sliced translucent thin and stacked thick, fragrant with garlic and peppercorns, and the mysterious alchemy of curing and smoking. The bread was rye, dense and flavorful, spread with spicy mustard that cleared your sinuses. Katz's Delicatessen opened in 1888 on the Lower East Side, and by the early 1900s it was famous for sandwiches that satisfied like a full meal, because they were a full meal. A pastrami on rye from Katz's wasn't a light lunch. It was a commitment, a 30-minute eating experience, a sandwich you'd remember for days afterward. Other delis followed suit, each developing their own variations, their own signature touches, competing to see who could stack meat highest while keeping the sandwich structurally sound enough to actually eat. Then there was the Reuben, corned beef, Swiss cheese, sauerkraut and Russian dressing, grilled on rye until the cheese melted and the bread crisped. Two origin stories compete for primacy. One claims Arnold Reuben created it at his New York delicatessen around 1914 when a hungry actress asked for something special. The other insists it was invented in Omaha, Nebraska in 1925 at a weekly poker game where grocer Reuben Kulakowski requested corned beef and sauerkraut, and the hotel kitchen added cheese and dressing to make it special. Both stories might be true, or neither, such is the nature of food legends. What matters is that by mid-century the Reuben had become an American classic, found in diners and delis from coast to coast. Its combination of tangy sauerkraut and rich meat perfectly balanced, the grilling process uniting all the elements into something greater than the sum of its parts. In Louisiana, the po' boy emerged from the collision of French bread-making tradition and Creole culture. During a 1929 streetcar workers' strike, brothers Benny and Clovis Martin reportedly gave free sandwiches to the striking poor boys, though similar sandwiches had existed under different names for decades before. What made the po' boy distinctive was the bread light, airy French loaves with crackly crusts, filled generously with fried oysters or shrimp, or roast beef swimming in gravy, dressed with lettuce, tomatoes, pickles and mayonnaise. The po' boy was a working-class meal, substantial and affordable, sold from corner shops and lunch counters across New Orleans. It represented a different sandwich philosophy than the deli tradition, less about towering height, more about the quality of the bread and the freshness of the filling, the way everything came together in messy, satisfying bites that required plenty of napkins. The club sandwich arrived in the 1890s, probably at the Union Club in New York, though the Saratoga Club also claimed its invention. This was an upper-crust creation, 3 slices of toasted bread forming 2 layers, with turkey or chicken on one level, bacon and tomato on the other, everything held together with toothpicks and cut into elegant triangles. The club sandwich became a symbol of a certain kind of American luxury, appearing on hotel room service menus at country clubs, in first-class train dining cars. It was aspirational food, suggesting leisure and comfort and the kind of life where servants brought you perfectly constructed sandwiches on silver trays. The BLT, bacon, lettuce, tomato, emerged as a simpler cousin to the club sandwich, possibly in the early 1900s, though its origins are murky. Some claim British ancestry, connecting it to Victorian tea sandwiches. Others insist it's purely American, born from the club sandwich stripped to its essential elements. Regardless, the BLT became a summer standard, best made when tomatoes were at their peak, when a ripe slice could transform ordinary bacon and lettuce into something approaching transcendence. The key, devotees insisted, was proper construction. Crispy bacon, fresh lettuce with bite, tomatoes sliced thick but not too thick, good mayonnaise, and bread toasted golden. Italian immigrants created their own sandwich universe. In New Orleans, the muffaletta combined Italian sesame-seeded bread with layers of Genoa salami, ham, mortadella, mozzarella, provolone, and a distinctive olive salad made with olives, celery, cauliflower, carrots, and garlic in olive oil. Central Grocery claimed invention of this round sandwich in 1906, when Salvatore Lupo created it for Sicilian farmers who came to his shop. Rather than eating their meats and cheeses separately, he combined everything into one easy-to-handle meal. In the Northeast, Italian sandwiches took different forms depending on the city. In Boston, they were Spuckies. In Philadelphia, Hoagies. In New York, Heroes. In Wilmington, Delaware, Capicola. All referred to roughly the same thing, a long roll split and filled with Italian cold cuts, provolone, lettuce, tomatoes, onions, hot peppers, olive oil, and vinegar. These submarines, yet another name, were working-class food, sold from corner stores and delis, wrapped in paper for construction workers and factory hands who needed substantial, affordable lunches. The names themselves tell a story of regional pride and local identity. Each city insisted their version was the original, their name the correct one, their particular combination of meats and condiments the definitive expression of the form. The sandwiches became emblems of neighborhood, markers of home, the kind of food that people who moved away would crave with almost physical longing. Then there was the grilled cheese, possibly the most democratic sandwich of all. Cheese and bread had been paired for centuries, of course, but the grilled cheese as Americans know it emerged in the 1920s, when inexpensive bread and processed cheese became widely available. During the Great Depression, it was one of the cheapest meals you could make, a slice of cheese between 2 slices of bread, buttered on the outside and cooked in a pan until golden and melted. Simple, filling, satisfying. The grilled cheese became children's food, comfort food, sick day food, the sandwich you made when you needed something warm and familiar and uncomplicated. Later variations added tomato soup for dipping, or bacon or tomatoes, but the basic form remained. Bread, cheese, butter, heat. Nothing fancy, nothing pretentious, just the pure pleasure of melted cheese on crispy bread. All these sandwiches and dozens more proliferated across America in the first half of the 20th century. They appeared in lunchboxes and diners, at picnics and parties, on trains and at baseball games. The sandwich proved itself adaptable to every regional cuisine, every cultural tradition, every economic level. It could be cheap or expensive, simple or elaborate, quick or carefully constructed. It was portable prosperity, democracy between bread slices, the great American contribution to world cuisine. And through all this innovation and variation, the basic principle established by the Earl of Sandwich remained unchanged. Convenience without compromise, satisfaction without ceremony, food that fit into life rather than requiring life to stop for it. By the middle of the 20th century, the sandwich had become something more than British invention or American innovation. It had become a global language of food, spoken with different accents in every corner of the world. In Vietnam, the banh mi emerged from the collision of French colonialism and Vietnamese culinary genius. The French brought baguettes, those long, crusty loaves that required skill and specific techniques to create. Vietnamese bakers adapted the recipe, making the bread lighter, airier, with a thinner crust that shattered more easily when bitten. Then they filled these modified baguettes with distinctly Vietnamese ingredients: grilled pork marinated in lemongrass, pickled daikon and carrots, fresh cilantro, cucumber, jalapenos, and a smear of pâté that acknowledged French influence while transforming it into something entirely new. The banh mi represented culinary fusion at its finest, neither purely French nor purely Vietnamese, but a third thing that transcended both origins. Street vendors sold them from bicycles fitted with glass cases, keeping the sandwiches fresh while cycling through neighborhoods. They were breakfast food, lunch food, anytime food, affordable and delicious, satisfying workers and students, and anyone who needed a quick meal that delivered complex flavors in portable form. In Cuba, meanwhile, the Cuban sandwich developed its own distinctive identity: roast pork, ham, Swiss cheese, pickles, and mustard, pressed between Cuban bread until the cheese melted and the exterior crisped. The sandwich reflected Cuba's complicated history: Spanish colonial influence in the roast pork, American presence in the yellow mustard, the pressing technique perhaps borrowed from Italian panini traditions. Tampa, Florida, with its large Cuban immigrant population, claimed to be the birthplace, though Havana insisted the sandwich originated there. As with so many food origin stories, the truth probably matters less than the deliciousness. Mexico's contribution came in forms both ancient and modern: the torta, a sandwich made with telera or bolillo rolls, filled with ingredients ranging from breaded and fried meat, milanesa, to slow-cooked pork, carnitas, to refried beans and avocado, represented Mexican sandwich culture at its most exuberant. These weren't delicate affairs, but robust, overstuffed creations that required 2 hands and considerable napkins. The bread was crucial, soft but sturdy enough to hold generous fillings, slightly sweet, perfect for soaking up juices and sauces. In Japan, the sandwich underwent a transformation that reflected Japanese aesthetics of precision and refinement. The katsu sando, a pork cutlet sandwich, featured a breaded and fried pork cutlet served between perfectly square slices of soft white shoku pan bread with the crusts removed, the whole sandwich cut into neat rectangles. The contrast was everything: crispy exterior of the meat against pillowy bread, tangy sauce against mild carbohydrate, Western technique filtered through Japanese sensibility. Even more distinctly Japanese were the egg salad sandwiches and fruit sandwiches found in convenience stores across the country. These sandwiches treated the format with the same attention to detail that Japanese culture brought to everything: exact proportions, perfect construction, ingredients of surprising quality for something sold from a refrigerated case. The fruit sandwich, or fruit sando, featured fresh strawberries and whipped cream between white bread, a sweet rather than savory interpretation that made perfect sense once you tried it. In South Africa, the bunny chow emerged from the Indian community in Durban, a hollowed-out loaf of bread filled with curry. This wasn't technically a sandwich in the strict sense of bread filling bread, but it captured the sandwich spirit of bread as both container and consumable. The curry soaked into the bread, flavoring it, and once you'd eaten the curry, you tore pieces of bread from the walls of the container and ate those too. It was ingenious, practical, and deeply satisfying. Developed originally as a way for Indian workers to carry curry to the fields without requiring separate containers, In the Middle East, falafel and shawarma tucked into pita bread represented an ancient approach to portable food being reinterpreted through modern convenience. The pita served as both plate and wrapper, catching juices and crumbs, making everything easier to eat while walking. Tahini sauce, pickled vegetables, fresh herbs, every element had a purpose, creating balance between richness and acidity, heat and cooling freshness. Each culture that encountered the sandwich format adapted it to local ingredients, local tastes, local needs. The basic principle, bread holding something delicious, proved infinitely flexible, capable of expressing any culinary tradition, any flavor profile, any dietary requirement or preference. Vegetarians could make sandwiches as easily as meat eaters. Spicy food lovers and those who preferred milder flavors could both find satisfaction. The sandwich was a template, not a prescription. And as the 20th century progressed, travel and immigration meant these sandwich traditions cross-pollinated. A Vietnamese immigrant might open a banh mi shop in Los Angeles, introducing Americans to a sandwich style they'd never encountered. An American tourist might try a bocadillo in Spain, a simple sandwich of Spanish bread and cured ham, and try to recreate it at home. The Cuban sandwich spread beyond Florida. The Japanese convenience store sandwich format inspired imitators in other countries. Falafel became standard fare in cities far from the Middle East. Fast food chains accelerated this global spread. McDonald's might have been known for burgers, but those burgers were, technically, a sandwich variant, and McDonald's adapted its menu to local tastes everywhere it opened. In India, where many people didn't eat beef, the menu featured chicken and vegetarian options. In Japan, rice burgers appeared alongside bread-based sandwiches. The chain became a kind of sandwich ambassador, demonstrating how the format could accommodate any ingredient, any cultural preference. By the end of the 20th century, you could travel almost anywhere on Earth and find sandwiches, though they might look and taste completely different from place to place. A sandwich in Australia might feature beetroot and fried egg alongside more conventional ingredients, a combination that would seem bizarre in America but made perfect sense in Australian sandwich culture. A sandwich in Scandinavia might be open-faced, more concerned with artful arrangement of toppings than with structural integrity. The sandwich had become a kind of culinary Esperanto, a universal concept implemented with infinite local variation. Everyone understood the basic idea, but everyone had their own interpretation, their own favourite version, their own strong opinions about what made a sandwich truly good. And isn't that beautiful, in a way, that something as simple as bread and filling could become a canvas for human creativity worldwide, could express cultural identity while remaining fundamentally approachable and unpretentious. The sandwich asked so little and offered so much. Convenience without sacrifice, satisfaction without fuss, endless possibility within a simple structure. The Earl of Sandwich, ordering his casual gaming table meal back in 1762, couldn't have imagined that his name would eventually be attached to food traditions from Hanoi to Havana, from Tokyo to Durban. But perhaps that's exactly the kind of contribution that matters most, not grand monuments or deliberate innovations, but small practical improvements that prove so useful they spread everywhere, adapting and evolving while remaining recognizable as variations on a single elegant theme. There's a particular kind of July afternoon that smells like childhood, grass clippings and sunscreen and, if you're lucky, sandwiches being made in a kitchen somewhere nearby. Think about it for a moment. Think about every sandwich you've ever eaten. The peanut butter and jelly your mother packed in your school lunch, cut into triangles with the crusts removed. The turkey sandwich you grabbed between meetings, eating at your desk while checking email. The elaborate creation you ordered at that restaurant where they took sandwiches seriously, treating them like architecture. The midnight sandwich you made from leftovers when you couldn't sleep, standing at the refrigerator in dim light, building something from whatever you found. These are small moments, unremarkable really, barely worth remembering individually, and yet they accumulate into something significant. The texture of daily life, the small comforts that get us through, the reliable pleasures we can count on when everything else feels uncertain. The sandwich is there for all of it. First day of school, road trips and picnics, lunch with friends, solitary meals at home, celebrations and ordinary Tuesdays. It adapts to every circumstance, every mood, every need. Hungry but rushed? A sandwich takes minutes. Wanting something special? A sandwich can be as elaborate as you like. Feeding a crowd? Sandwiches multiply easily, democratically, giving everyone exactly what they want. This adaptability, this fundamental flexibility, is what allowed a gaming table convenience to become a global phenomenon. The sandwich succeeded not by insisting on one correct way of being, but by offering a framework that could accommodate infinite variation. It's a generous format, welcoming to experimentation, forgiving of substitutions, open to interpretation. Consider what the sandwich doesn't require. It doesn't require cooking skills. A child can make one. It doesn't require special equipment beyond a knife and perhaps a cutting board. It doesn't require expensive ingredients, though it welcomes them if you have them. It doesn't require time, though you can invest time if you want to. It doesn't require sitting down, though it's perfectly happy to be eaten at a table. It asks almost nothing and judges even less. This unpretentiousness might be the sandwich's greatest virtue. In a world where food can become competitive, where meals can carry the weight of status and performance and social signaling, the sandwich remains resolutely down to earth. Yes, there are fancy sandwiches, elaborate restaurant creations with ingredients you can barely pronounce, price tags that make you wince, but the same word, sandwich, also applies to 2 slices of bread with butter and jam, to a quick lunch of leftover chicken and lettuce, to whatever you assemble from the back of the refrigerator when groceries are running low. The sandwich is democratic in the truest sense, available to everyone, adaptable to any circumstance, capable of satisfying both the wealthy diner at an exclusive restaurant and the factory worker eating lunch from a paper bag. It crosses every boundary of class, culture, economics. It belongs to no one and everyone simultaneously. And maybe that's what John Montagu accidentally discovered that evening in 1762, standing there at the gaming table with his simple request for meat between bread. Not just a way to eat without interrupting his cards, but a deeper truth about human needs and human ingenuity. We want satisfaction without ceremony. We want nourishment without fuss. We want food that fits into our lives rather than requiring our lives to stop for it. The medieval bakers who made trenchers understood this. The Armenian women slapping lavash against tandoor walls understood this. The Ottoman street vendors wrapping meat in flatbread understood this. The Jewish deli owners stacking pastrami high on rye understood this. Otto Rohwedder, obsessively building his bread slicing machine, understood this. They all, in their different times and places, recognized something fundamental about how people actually want to eat. Not every meal needs to be an event. Not every bite requires contemplation. Sometimes, often, really, we just need food that satisfies, that tastes good, that doesn't demand more attention than we have to give. The sandwich delivers exactly that, no more and no less. There's a comfort in this reliability, in knowing that no matter where you are, no matter what's happening in your life, you can make or find a sandwich. It's food as anchor, as constant, as the baseline from which everything else departs, but to which everything can return. Fancy dinners are wonderful, exotic cuisines are exciting, experimental cooking has its place, but the sandwich is always there, patient and unpretentious, ready when you need it. In our contemporary moment, with all its complications and anxieties and endless choices, there's something almost radical about the sandwich's simplicity. It doesn't require apps or research or reading reviews. It doesn't trend or go viral. It just exists, fulfilling its purpose day after day, taken for granted precisely because it's so reliable. And taken for granted is okay. Not everything needs to be noticed or celebrated or made special. Some things can simply be useful, can quietly make life a little easier, can provide small moments of satisfaction without asking for recognition. The sandwich does this work beautifully, has done it for centuries, will continue doing it for centuries more. Think about how many sandwiches are being made right now, this very moment, somewhere on Earth. Someone packing lunch for their children before school. Someone at a deli counter ordering their usual. Someone standing at a kitchen counter at 3 a.m, unable to sleep, building something from whatever's available. Someone at a picnic, unwrapping sandwiches they made that morning. Someone in a food truck, assembling orders as fast as hands can move. Someone discovering for the first time how good a really excellent sandwich can be. All these people, all these moments, all connected by something as simple as bread and filling. The sandwich doesn't unite us in any grand or meaningful way. It's not a cause or a movement or a statement, but it does remind us that human needs and human solutions are often remarkably similar across cultures, across centuries, across all the things that supposedly divide us. We all get hungry. We all need something that's easy and satisfying and doesn't require fuss. We all appreciate when something works well, when a simple idea proves itself over and over, when convenience and pleasure align perfectly. The sandwich gives us all of that, has given it to billions of people across generations. We'll keep giving it as long as humans are around to appreciate bread and whatever seems good between slices. So perhaps we should pause occasionally and appreciate this odd miracle that an English earl's casual request for gaming table food became a global phenomenon, that medieval trenchers evolved into Vietnamese banh mi, that Otto Roverder's obsession made millions of lunches easier, that something so simple could prove so endlessly adaptable and satisfying. The next time you make a sandwich, or buy one, or eat one without thinking about it, you're participating in a tradition that stretches back centuries and forward into an unknowable future. You're connected to everyone who ever solved hunger with bread and filling, from ancient shepherds wrapping cheese in flatbread to modern office workers grabbing lunch between meetings. That's not nothing. That's actually quite beautiful in its quiet way. The sandwich doesn't ask for your attention, doesn't demand to be appreciated, doesn't care if you understand its history or significance. It just sits there, ready when you need it, ready to do what it's always done, sustain you, satisfy you, get you through whatever comes next. And sometimes, on the best days, it does a little more than that. Sometimes a really good sandwich can make you pause mid-bite and think, yes, this is exactly what I needed. This is exactly right. That moment of simple contentment, that might be the Earl of Sandwich's greatest legacy. Not his political career or his naval administration or his support for exploration, but a format for food that's still creating those small perfect moments. Hundreds of years later, billions of times a day, everywhere humans gather and eat and go about their lives. Not bad for something that started with cards and hunger and an impatient request for meat. Between bread,